All right, let's dive right into this explainer and set out on a historical investigation to uncover a major textual debate surrounding the very origins of early Christian belief. We're going to look at some fascinating source material from Marc Bates that digs deep into ancient texts, grammar, and history to explore exactly when and how the earliest followers of Jesus actually began to view him as divine.
So here is the massive central mystery we're unpacking today. It's a huge debate in historical and biblical scholarship. Looking really closely at ancient texts, we want to see if the earliest followers believed Jesus was divine from the absolute start, or if that idea was just invented decades later, sort of evolving as the movement grew. The answer to this question radically shifts how we understand the foundation of a major world religion, and our source text takes a very specific, grammar-driven approach to solving it.
To navigate this dense theological mystery, we've got a clear roadmap to follow. We'll start with the great Christology debate, define the creator-creature divide, look at the evolutionary theory, examine clues in Paul's letters and the book of Hebrews, and finally, look at God's unfolding promise plan.
Okay, part 1. The great Christology debate, ontology versus function.
What are we really arguing about here? Well, at the core of this debate is ontology, which is just a metaphysical term for the actual nature of being. Did early Christians believe Jesus merely functioned like a divine agent, doing God's work on earth as a highly exalted human, or did they believe he was actually God in his very nature? Our source argues that the earliest texts claim a literal personal pre-existence as a divine being, which goes way beyond just saying Jesus functioned like God.
Moving on to part 2, the creator-creature divide, first-century metaphysics. To really grasp the stakes of this debate, we have to put ourselves in the cognitive environment of the time. In first-century Jewish thought, there was an absolute, impenetrable brick wall between two categories of existence. On one side, you have the uncreated creator, self-existent and eternal. On the other side, you have literally everything else, all created reality, which is finite and has a beginning. Any entity credited with creation or eternal attributes was placed strictly on the creator side of this divide. There was no middle ground, no demigod category in strict Jewish monotheism.
Section 3. The evolutionary theory, often called the backward trajectory.
So, there's this very popular backward trajectory hypothesis held by modern critics like James Dunn and Bart Ehrman. They argue that early Christians originally viewed Jesus merely as a human prophet. Over time, the moment of his supposed divinity got pushed further and further back. In AD 30, they say, believers thought he was exalted at his resurrection. By AD 65, the Gospel of Mark pushes his divine sonship back to his baptism. By AD 80, Luke pushes it back to his birth. And it isn't until the Gospel of John around AD 90 that we finally get the idea of eternal pre-existence. The theory here is that the idea of his eternal divinity just evolved backward over decades of storytelling.
Now, to support this timeline, these scholars often lean on a concept called ideal pre-existence. Basically, the idea is that when ancient texts say someone existed before the world began, they don't mean a literal living person. They just mean they existed as a dynamic thought, a plan, or a blueprint in the mind of God. So critics argue Jesus didn't literally exist before Bethlehem. He was just a foreordained plan. But our source text challenges this reduction heavily, pointing directly to the grammatical logic of the earliest documents we actually possess.
Which brings us to Section 4, clues in Paul's letters, syntactic showdowns.
Let's look at the absolute earliest surviving Christian writings to counter the evolutionary timeline, the letters of Paul written between AD 48 and 62, way before the Gospels were finalized. Take a look at this quote from Philippians chapter 2, who, although existing in the form of God, emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant. Scholars widely recognize this passage as an ancient Christ hymn that actually predates Paul's letter. It likely originated in the AD 30s or 40s. This is a massive data point, because it shows that a very high view of Christ's divinity existed within a single decade of the crucifixion. It completely challenges the idea that it took 60 years to invent.
And this brings us to a super fascinating Greek word, kenosis, which translates to the act of emptying. Some folks have argued this meant Jesus emptied himself of his divine attributes, but our source author points out that when you look at the precise Greek syntax right there in the text, this emptying is defined not as subtracting deity, but as adding humanity. By taking the form of a servant, it was a voluntary self-limitation for a specific redemptive mission. It wasn't a created angel getting a divine promotion. The pre-existent person didn't lose his nature, he just veiled his glory.
Then we have Paul doing something absolutely wild in 1 Corinthians 8:6. He takes the foundational Jewish prayer, the Shema, which declares the Lord is one, and completely reworks it. He essentially splits the confession, applying one God to the Father and one Lord to Jesus Christ. On top of that, he explicitly ascribes the creation and preservation of the universe to Jesus. Remember that strict metaphysical brick wall we talked about earlier? Paul is deliberately taking Jesus and dropping him directly onto the creator side of that divide, and he's doing this in the AD 50s.
Let's jump to section 5, the evidence in Hebrews, translating the jargon.
Our source digs into the Epistle to the Hebrews and argues it is absolutely packed with dense, syntactically sophisticated declarations of Christ's supreme identity. Using a fantastic taxonomy from scholars Bowman and Komaszewski, known as the HANDS acronym, the source demonstrates how Hebrews systematically attributes 5 exclusive pillars of Yahweh directly to Jesus: honors, attributes, names, deeds, and seat. These are rights and titles strictly 100% reserved for the uncreated creator in Jewish thought, yet the author of Hebrews boldly applies every single one of them to Christ.
To decode some of the really dense ancient jargon in Hebrews chapter 1, the author focuses on the Greek word karakter. Today, we hear that and think of a personality trait, but in ancient Greek, a karakter was the precise die stamp impression made on a coin. So, the text is essentially comparing the sun to the exact uncreated die stamp of God's underlying reality. It's an incredibly physical, concrete metaphor used to argue that Jesus is the exact, objective, ontological reality of God.
This is where it gets really granular, but stick with me because it's a huge clue. In Hebrews chapter 2, there is a deliberate shift in Greek verb tenses. When speaking of humanity's condition, the author uses the perfect tense verb kakoinonekin, indicating an ongoing, permanent condition of being locked into flesh and blood mortality. You didn't choose to be human, right? You just are. But when speaking of the Son, the text suddenly shifts to the aorist tense mitition, which denotes a specific, voluntary, and completed historical choice to partake in humanity. By analyzing this subtle grammar, the author argues the text is portraying a pre-existent Son who voluntarily stepped down into humanity, rather than a human who originated from it and somehow got promoted. Finally, section 6, God's unfolding promise plan, the big picture. Pulling all these textual and grammatical threads together, our source points to Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan Theology. This framework views the entire biblical narrative as a single, organically unified divine purpose. The pre-existent Son isn't just waiting around off stage. He acts as the active, visible mediator throughout all of Old Testament history. The crucial takeaway here is that the incarnation isn't viewed as some sudden emergency creation of a secondary god or a late Hellenistic invention. Instead, it is the climactic historical entrance of a pre-existent person carrying forward a unified cosmic narrative that preserves the original promises made across the historical covenants. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a pretty profound question to chew on. Does our understanding of a few ancient Greek verbs completely change the historical trajectory of a major world religion? Whether you lean toward the evolutionary model or the early ontological model, one thing is absolutely clear. The nuances of ancient syntax and historical context profoundly shape how we understand the foundation of global beliefs. They force us to keep investigating, keep questioning, and keep digging into the text. I hope this explainer gave you some incredible new insights into the great Christology debate.